Hello class. I'm starting you with this picture on purpose. This is a picture of the whole earth. And what we're going to do today in our lesson is we are going to cover integers. And we are going to study pretty much and talk about just about everything about integers. We're going to talk about what they are, we're going to talk about absolute value, and we're going to talk about the three commandments that we're going to use to add and subtract any integer. Now, if you look in your book, this corresponds with lessons 1.4, 1.5, and 1.6. So this one video is going to cover all three of those lessons. So you really want to pay attention closely. Make sure that all your distractions are put away and that you really focus in, because we're going to have three different lessons covered by tonight's video. All right? So strap on your seatbelts. Let's get started. So let's talk a little bit about what is an integer. All right. An integer is a whole number that is either negative or positive. Sorry, negative or positive, or it could be zero. Okay, so very quickly, integers would be things like 0, 1, 2, 3, ... Continuing on. As high as you can count, those are integers. But if we go backwards to the left, it would also include things like negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. Okay, any positive or negative whole number or zero is an integer. Okay, so that's what an integer is. So when you hear the word integer, I want you to immediately think, that means Mr. Gunn's probably going to be talking about both positive and negative numbers. Positive or negative numbers. And don't forget, we also have 0. 0 is kind of right in the middle, and before you ask, 0 is neither positive nor negative. It's kind of in the middle. So a number is either positive, or it's negative, or it's 0. Okay, that's what an integer is. That doesn't seem so bad. So now let's talk a little bit about absolute value. You've probably seen the symbol before, the absolute value of x. It's on your calculators. Okay, and what the absolute value does is really quite simple. If you take the absolute value of a positive number, like 7, okay, the absolute value of 7 is just 7. All the absolute value is asking is how far is this number away from 0. So the absolute value of 7 comes out to be 7, and the absolute value of negative 7, well, let's think. Negative 7 is also 7 units away from 0. Even though it's to the left, it's still 7 units away. Okay? So another way to think of this is an absolute value of a positive number doesn't really do anything. It just leaves it alone. But the absolute value of a negative number will flip it around to its opposite sign. So if you start with a negative number, you're going to always end up with a positive number. Now, that said, there is one small exception. Again, we have this number 0 up here. The absolute value of 0, well, how far is 0 away from itself? Well, it's equal to itself, so it is a distance of 0 away. So that's, again, the only exception. So the absolute value of a number, and sometimes we say the absolute value of a non-zero number, is always going to be positive. Okay, and again, two ways to think of it. Take the absolute value of a number, it always strips off the negative sign. That's one way to think of it. Another way to think of it is the absolute value of a number is how far is that number from 0. And the distance will always be a non-negative number, so it could be 0 or positive. All right. Now, that is 1.4. That's really all there is to 1.4. 1.4 we'll talk about some natural applications of integers. I think already your minds are probably thinking of examples where you see negative numbers. A good example would be in money. Okay, so if you put money into a checking account, that's positive. If you take money out or you make a deposit or make a withdrawal from a savings account, that's negative. If a stock price goes up, that's positive. If it goes down, you're losing money, that's negative. Okay, you can also think about various statistics or comparisons. Positive means something is a statistic or a number is more than something. Negative would mean it's a little less. If you're gaining or losing weight, plus would probably mean you're gaining weight, minus would mean you're losing weight. Okay, you get the idea. Negative and positive numbers come up all the time in mathematics and in real life. All right, so where we really start to get into trouble, and there was a reason that your book split this topic up into 3 separate lessons, and that is because people really have trouble dealing with positive and negative numbers. Now, we're going to talk about multiplying and dividing them a little bit later. That'll be another video. But today, let's talk about combining integers when we're adding or subtracting. So when we're talking about we're talking about plus and minus. Okay? Now, so examples of this would be something like 3 plus negative 7, or negative 8 plus negative 10. All right? When we're adding or subtracting integers, we're going to follow 3 very simple rules. And they're such fundamental rules, I like to have a little fun with them, and I call them the 3 commandments of math. Now, the 3 commandments of math are as follows. Commandment number 1 is thou shalt not subtract. Instead, we're always going to add the opposite. So that may seem a little odd. Let's flip back to this slide for a second. Okay, what if I had something like negative 7 minus 9? Well, the first commandment says, thou shalt not subtract. So what we're going to do is we're going to change negative 7 minus 9, we're going to change it into negative 7. Instead of subtracting, we're going to add. And now, if we're adding, put a little plus sign right there, we're going to add the opposite of negative 9. Well, let's think about it. What is the opposite of negative 9? Well, it's positive 9, isn't it? So what we're going to do first is anytime we have a subtraction problem like this, we're going to first change the problem into an addition problem. All right, so that's what the first commandment's talking about. Thou shalt not subtract, add the opposite instead. Now, once we've changed all the problems into addition problems, there is no more subtraction. We've got positive and negative numbers, and we're adding them together. All right, so the second commandment says, look, if the two things that you're adding together both have the same sign, they might both be positive, or they might both be negative. What we're going to do is we're going to find the sum. In other words, we're just going to add the values together. So whether we're doing 3 plus 5, which we know is 8, or negative 3 plus negative 5, again, we're going to add the values together. We're going to find the sum of the values. And I really should put that in right here. I don't really have enough room, so I'm going to write it in a different color. So when I say sum and difference, just of the values, and again, going back to what we just said a second ago, that's the value. That's just the number part. We're going to ignore the sign completely. We're just going to look at the value. So the second commandment says if the two numbers have the same sign, find their sum. So the negative 3 plus negative 8, or I'm sorry, negative 3 plus negative 5, again, the values 3 and 5, their sum is 8. If the two things have different signs, one happens to be positive and one happens to be negative, you can think of that kind of like a tug of war. Okay, one's working in one direction, pulling you in the positive direction. The other one is pulling you in the negative direction. They're kind of working against each other. So what we're going to do in that case is we're going to take the two values, regardless of which one's positive and which one's negative, because you're going to have one of each, and we're going to find the difference. So again, let's use 3 and 5. If we have 3 plus negative 5, well, they're different signs, and the difference between 5 and 3 is 2. On the other hand, if we have negative 3 and positive 5, it doesn't matter. The difference between 5 and 3 is still 2. So it does not matter which one's negative. It does not matter which one's positive. We just want the difference between the two values. That's the second commandment. So thou shalt not subtract. If the two things that so we're going to add instead, and we have to change things around a little bit. We'll practice these in a moment. And if the two things have the same sign, we're going to find the sum. And if they have different signs, we're going to find the difference. Now, the third commandment is really just to finish up the answer. Okay? So thou look at the two numbers that you just added together. If they both had the same sign, well, the answer is going to have the same sign. It really doesn't matter which one's bigger. So if you add two positive numbers together, the answer is positive. And if you add two negative numbers together, really regardless of which number is bigger or has a bigger value, the answer is going to come out negative. If I owe you $3 and I owe somebody else $5, I owe a total of $8. 3 and 5, I'd find the sum, which is 8. And since they were both negative quantities, my end answer is going to be negative 8. The only one that gets a little tricky is the one right here where we had different signs. If we have different signs, we have that tug of war going on, we find the difference of the values. And the third commandment deals with that. So in this case, thou shalt keep the sign of thy larger value. So, if you had the example with 3 and 5 that we just mentioned a second ago, if you do 3 plus negative 5, well, the difference between 3 and 5 is 2, and the larger value is the 5, and it happens to be the negative number, so the answer comes out negative 2. Whereas, if we'd had negative 3 plus positive 5, again, the difference between 3 and 5 is 2, but now the negative number was the smaller value and the positive was bigger. All right, so those are the 3 commandments. Okay, you can back up and look at these at any time, and you probably noticed today I already had them up on the board because we were talking about this in ISM class the other day. That little tablet that I drew on the sideboard right next to the door in my room are the 3 commandments. If you're in Mr. Hurst's class, I'm sure he'll probably go ahead and write them up on the board for you too, but you can also come back to this video and review the 3 commandments. Thou shalt not subtract, same sign sum, different signs difference, and the 3rd commandment, thou shalt keep the sign of thy larger value. All right, I don't want this video to get real long, and we're already over 11 minutes, so let's quickly go ahead and practice using the 3 commandments. The first problem here, 3 plus negative 11. Okay, this one is already an addition problem because we're adding a positive and a negative number together. We're adding 2 things with different signs, so we're going to find the difference, and the difference between 3 and 11 is 8. Okay, and we're going to keep the sign of the larger value, which is the 11, and it happens to be negative, so the answer is negative 8. Okay, what I'd like you to do right now is I'd like you to pause the video for a moment. Just get a piece of paper. Ideally, if you have your math notebook home, you can go ahead and you can solve, we'll call this number 2, 3, 4, 5. If you don't, just grab a piece of scrap paper for a second. So go ahead and pause this video while you find a piece of scrap paper, and as soon as you are ready to write, go ahead and write down these 4 problems and go ahead and solve them. All right? When you're done, go ahead and press play again, and we'll go through them together and we'll make sure you have the right answers. Okay, no cheating. Please do the problems in advance before we actually get started. So pause the video now. Make sure you hit pause. All right. So if you follow directions, you have already solved all 4 of these questions. So let's just review your work and see if you did it using the correct order, application of the 3 commandments. So this one is already a plus. We're adding negative 7 and negative 8. They're both negative, so we're going to find the same sign, so we're going to find the sum, which is 15. Since they were both negative, and technically the larger value is the negative 8, it doesn't really matter since they're both negative, we get negative 15. Okay, the 3rd commandment still works when they're the same sign, but it's a little more obvious then. The next question was started out as a subtraction question, so the 1st commandment comes into play here. So we're going to change this. Instead of 4 minus 17, the minus is going to become a plus, and the 17 was positive. We're going to change it into a negative. So we're going to, really the same thing if you think about a number line. We're starting at 4 and we're going back 17. Well, that's kind of what this says. We're starting at 4 and we're adding negative 17. Now we can apply the 2nd commandment. The 2 numbers have different signs, so we're going to find their difference. The difference is 17 and 4 is 13, and we're going to keep the sign of the larger value, which was the 17, so we get negative 13 as the answer. The next one, again, starts with a subtraction, so we're going to change that into negative 3 plus the opposite of 10, which is negative 10. And now we're adding 2 things together that have the same sign, so we're going to find their sum, which is 13. They're both negative, so this one also comes out, for a very different reason, comes out to be negative 13. And finally, the last one, once again, we started with a subtraction problem, so let's rewrite that as negative 11 plus instead of minus, and now the opposite of negative 8 is positive 8. And the difference between 11 and 8, it's because they're different signs, is 3. And we're going to keep the sign of the larger value, which is negative, so we get negative 3. Okay, so double check your work. Those should be your answers for these 5 problems. And if you got those right, then you're well on your way to mastering the adding and subtracting of integers. If you had any trouble with those, feel free to back up and review this video a little bit more. We are biting off a lot here. We are covering 3 lessons, and we will go over these carefully in class and really practice them. Okay, so go ahead, and you might want to just remind yourself the 3 commandments. Those would be really good questions for the daily quiz in class. Okay? And then also make sure you remember this right here, what the absolute value means. Again, very good question for the daily quiz. All right, once again, I know that was a lot, hence the slide at the beginning, but that is pretty much everything that you really need to know to get started dealing with integers. Hope you enjoyed the video and look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow. Take care, everybody.